The B2 Super Battle Droid has carried a different voice in almost every Star Wars project it has appeared in. In the Legends game Republic Commando, it growls through a dark corridor like a war machine hunting its next target. In the canon animated series The Clone Wars, the same droid stumbles through a scene like a slow, confused toddler with a blaster for an arm. The body is identical across both projects, down to the hunched shoulders and the wrist-mounted cannons. The voices could belong to two completely different droids. Republic Commando released in 2005, and the Clone Wars followed 3 years later. In that short window, the B2 went from a droid that sounded like it could cut through a room full of trained soldiers to the one that struggled to finish a sentence. The B2 was designed from the start without a locked voice, a catchphrase, and a signature audio filter. Each project pushed the droid's sound further from the last, and by the time anyone could have noticed, the distance was permanent. The deepest cause of that drift was built into the droid's design from the very beginning. The B2 entered Star Wars without a single spoken word. The canon film Attack of the Clones introduced the droid in 2002, and its most recognized film image is not a battlefield moment. It is the Geonosian factory floor, row after row of B2s rolling off conveyor belts, identical, stamped out like industrial products. The B2 arrived as a mass-produced unit. In Attack of the Clones, it does not speak. Ben Burtt and his team at Skywalker Sound built the prequel soundscape around audio signatures that audiences would remember for decades. The lightsaber hum, R2-D2's beeps, and Darth Vader's breathing were each locked into the franchise from the moment they first appeared. The B2 received none of that attention, and its audio presence was limited to servo whirs, heavy footsteps, and wrist blaster fire, background noise that filled a wide battle shot and disappeared the moment the scene moved on. The droid's hunched posture, built-in wrist blasters, and heavier frame were designed to communicate danger in wide-angle battle shots. The Battle of Geonosis involved hundreds of Jedi, thousands of clone troopers, and enormous waves of droids filling the screen, and the B2 was built to look imposing from 50 meters away in that crowd. The creative teams that followed inherited that shape and kept adjusting it across different media, but the visual was the only reference they had. The body itself shifted slightly between the films and the animated series, adjusted for different animation styles, and the voice had even less holding it in place. Genndy Tartakovsky's Clone Wars, a 2003 Legends animated series, reinforced the B2's silence at the worst possible moment. The shorts treated droid armies as serious military forces that could push back against trained Republic soldiers. B2s marched in coordinated waves and held key positions, absorbing punishment without slowing down. Across all of it, they did not make a sound. Audiences who watched the shorts did not expect the B2 to speak. They expected it to fire and to fall. Tardikovsky built the B2 entirely around its body, and the silence between the gunshots was part of that design. The droid moved like a heavy machine, turned slowly, and absorbed damage the way armored vehicles do. For 3 years, this was the only version of the B2 that fans saw between films. The shorts ran during the gap between Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, which meant that they were the primary Star Wars content for a generation of fans during those years. For those fans, the B2 was the silent, imposing wall. Tartakovsky locked that image into their memory at the exact moment two different industries, animation and gaming, were about to give the B2 its first voices at almost the same time. The B2's first repeatable voices arrived through Star Wars games, and they were already splitting apart. The Legends game Star Wars Battlefront arrived in 2004, its Legends sequel Battlefront 2 followed in 2005, and Republic Commando launched the same year. The Battlefront game sorted players into different soldier roles on each side, and the B2 was the Separatist heavy unit. When a player selected it, the droid's voice became their voice. They heard it call out targets, respond to damage, and acknowledge fire support. Pandemic Studios built the Battlefront voice to be functional. It barked out squad positions through a gruff mechanical filter, clipped and forceful, a voice that made the droids sound like a heavy combat unit issuing field commands.
Weapons operational.
My weapons are also operational.
Irrelevant.
Pandemic designed those recordings to fill the player's ears during a session and fade the moment the game ended. But for fans who played those games for hundreds of hours, the functional voice became personal. A player who spawned as a B2 on Geonosis heard that gruff filters call out targets while they marched across the same dust plane where the droid had first appeared in Attack of the Clones. They inhabited this droid, and the version they heard while playing was the one they absorbed as the real B2, because it was the one they wore. A player does not just observe a character for 2 hours, a player lives inside one for hundreds, and the voice becomes part of how they move through the game. Republic Commando had a completely different problem to solve. It was a military game built around tension and close-quarter survival. Levels like the derelict assault ship Prosecutor pushed players into tight hallways and pitch-dark corridors where enemies appeared suddenly, filling the doorway before the player had time to prepare. The squad chatter kept reminding players that they were outnumbered and deep inside enemy territory. In that moment, the B2 could not sound like background infantry in a wide shot. It had to sound like a heavy frame advancing through the same dim corridor from the other direction, capable of ending a squad. Clint Young, credited in the game manual for voicing both the Battle Droid and the Super Battle Droid, delivered a B2 built around layered combat audio. A low scanning tone signaled the droid was surging. The rising whine of the wrist cannon told the player exactly how many seconds they had left to find cover. Then came the deep roar when the droid locked on and opened fire, a sound that meant the fight had already started whether the player was ready or not. When a B2 rounded a corner in Republic Commando, the sound reached the player before the visual did. It filled the hallway and vibrated through the squad's helmet speakers. The B2 had only existed in wide shots until this game, as part of a distant army viewed from above. Republic Commando was the first project to put the droid close enough for the audio to matter more than the shape, and the sound design made that closeness terrifying. By 2005, the B2 already carried separate voices sealed inside separate projects, none of them built from the same recordings. The films had given no vocal template to follow, and the Legends animated shorts had reinforced the B2's silence through 2 full years of content. Every game audio that touched the B2 during this period was working from the same blank canvas, and each one filled it differently. The films pushed the B2 even further from its original silence, and the direction they chose would outweigh the games entirely. The canon film Revenge of the Sith arrived in 2005, and unlike Attack of the Clones, it gave Super Battle Droids brief comic dialogue during sequences aboard General Grievous's flagship. Deep inside the ship near the main hangar, a pair of B2s reacted to an intrusion with confused, slow responses, their voices carrying a deep mechanical tone that would later define the Clone Wars version. The writers treated these droids as slow, simple machines, and Lucas himself had been steering droid armies towards comedy since The Phantom Menace. The B1s were written to be funny from their first scene, and by Revenge of the Sith, that comedic pull had extended to every battle droid on screen. The B2 was supposed to be a serious upgrade, but Lucas's vision of droids as comic relief was strong enough to pull even the heavy infantry unit into the same lane. The B2 that had entered the franchise as a silent combat unit was now fumbling through lines in a major theatrical release. Republic Commando and Revenge of the Sith released in the same year, but the game's dark, squad-level tension and the film's broad adventure comedy were aimed at completely different audiences. In Star Wars, films set the creative direction, and games follow. Revenge of the Sith reached millions more viewers than Republic Commando, and that difference in reach decided which B2 would survive. A player who had spent months hearing the B2 growl through Republic Commando's corridors would walk into the theater and hear the same droid stumbling through a punchline, and neither version had any connection to the other. For the generation that had grown up with Republic Commando through their school years, the comedic B2 landed as a sharp break from the droid they knew. Matthew Wood and the Clone Wars cemented the comedic B2 for an entire generation who would know no other version. When the animated series premiered in 2008, created by George Lucas with Dave Filoni as supervising director, it brought Wood into a central role. Wood was a key figure at Skywalker Sound who had been deeply involved in Star Wars audio and droid voices. In interviews, he said that by Revenge of the Sith and into the Clone Wars, he was voicing all the battle droids. Wood positioned the B2 as the B1's heavier, slower opposite. The B1 already chattered and glitched its way through scenes, so Wood made the B2 the quiet, confused one standing next to it, working through a single sentence like it was processing each word for the first time. A Clone Wars B2 might tilt its head before receiving an order, pause a beat too long before responding, then deliver its line in a low rumble that made it sound lost. Wood built that contrast on purpose for a show that balanced adventure with humor aimed at younger audiences. Woods' performance turned a fearless combat unit into a recognizable screen presence, a droid audiences could laugh with. Meanwhile, the Republic Commando B2 remained frozen in 2005, still growing through dark hallways in the memories of a completely different fanbase. The canon game Battlefront 2, published by EA in 2017, carried a B2 voice the original Battlefront players did not recognize. The vocal approach drew from the Clone Wars rather than from the gruff, clipped recordings that Pandemic Studios had built over a decade earlier. Players who modified game files built custom audio packages that stripped out the newer recordings and installed Republic Commando and classic Battlefront voices in their place. These went beyond cosmetic tweaks. Players were reaching into the game's code and manually rebuilding the B2's voice because they had absorbed a different version entirely. Online forums filled with side-by-side comparison videos that placed the original Battlefront B2 next to the 2017 version and let the contrast speak for itself. Players who made those mods did not treat this as a preference, they treated it as a correction, restoring a voice that the official release had overwritten with one they had not recognized. The third season of the canon live-action series The Mandalorian took the B2 further from its origins than any project before it. On Plazir 15, reprogrammed battle droids served as the city's entire labor force, and B2s that had once marched against clone troopers were now hauling cargo on loading docks. A heavy combat frame designed for war was performing manual labor in a peaceful city. The camera lingered on the B2s working their shifts, moving crates and sweeping floors with arms that were built to fire. The image landed with a quiet sadness that no previous Star Wars project had drawn from this droid. When the episode's central mystery revealed that some droids were reverting to their original combat programming, the B2 briefly flickered between its labor mode and its original combat state on screen. For a few seconds, the audience watched a droid designed for war try to become a soldier again inside a body that had been reprogrammed to sweep floors. The B2s in those scenes carried a tone that belonged to neither Republic Commando's menace nor the Clone Wars' confused comedy. The voice had shifted again, reshaped to fit a world where the war was over and the droids had been assigned new lives. Lucas designed the B1 for comedy and the B2 for threat, and the franchise spent 2 decades blurring the line between them. The B1 arrived as a mass-produced infantry droid built for comedy, dim-witted and glitch-prone from its first appearance. Lucas designed the B2 as the B1's heavier opposite, bigger and more independent, built to carry weight in combat, but his own creative preference for droid humor kept pulling the B2 back towards comedy, and the teams that followed his lead had no reason to push back. The B2 just kept shifting, and each shift pulled it closer from the version that came before. The Clone Wars itself held both versions inside the same show. The battle at Point Rain treated the droid army as a lethal wall of resistance that clone troopers had to breach at enormous cost, with B2s anchoring defensive positions and absorbing fire that would have destroyed lighter units. Clone troopers died trying to push through those lines, and the B2s held their ground through it. The Ryloth arc showed a full-scale occupation and force by overwhelming droid firepower, with B2s marching through civilian streets as the heavier backbone of the Separatist ground force. Villagers ran from the sound of their footsteps. In those arcs, the camera held the B2 as an obstacle worth showing, its heavy frame drawing sustained fire long after the lighter droids around it had been destroyed. In lighter episodes, the same droids stumble through doorways and fail to follow simple orders, sometimes just a few episodes apart. The B2 drifted in a franchise where other droids held their identities for decades, and the reason comes down to design specificity. The droideka, whose rolling deployment and shield generators had made an immediate impression from the Phantom Menace, held the same identity through the Clone Wars and into every project that followed. Characters reacted with alarm the moment one appeared, and the camera framed it differently from the rest of the droid army. The droideka's identity held because its combat design was so specific that no creative team could reframe it without breaking the droid entirely. The Commando droid, introduced later in the Clone Wars, carried a similar locked identity from its first appearance. It was stealthy and faster than standard droids, designed for precision strikes. The droideka and the Commando droid both operated within clearly defined roles, and neither one drifted. The B2 sat in the middle. Its design placed it above the B1, but Lucasfilm kept treating it as disposable. When a creative team needed heavy infantry to fill a scene, the B2 was available. When they needed an imposing frame to hold a hallway, the B2 served that purpose too. The voice shifted to match whatever the scene required, and the B2 was versatile enough to absorb each new direction without breaking. 2 words, Roger Roger, gave the B1 a vocal template that held across decades. The phrase appeared in 1999 and has survived into every Star Wars project since. Audiences recognize a B1 instantly in any Star Wars project. With a B2, the voice has sounded different so often that most audiences stopped tracking what it was supposed to sound like a long time ago. When Aspyr re-released Republic Commando in 2021 for modern consoles, a new wave of players encountered the threatening B2 for the first time. Many of them had only known this droid through the Clone Wars comedy, and the Republic Commando version, growling through their speakers, sounded like an entirely different machine. Players who had grown up with the comedic B2 were hearing a version from 2005 for the first time, and the disconnect was jarring enough to fill entire discussion threads. 16 years had passed between the original release and the re-release, and in that time, the B2 had become a comedy droid for an entire generation. The Republic Commando version felt like a visitor from a franchise they did not recognize. Star Wars is famous for preserving its most recognizable sounds across decades, and the B2 was left outside that system. Ben Burtt created the lightsaber hum, R2-D2's beeps, and Darth Vader's breathing at Skywalker sound, and those sounds have been maintained across hundreds of projects spanning films, games, and television. Lucasfilm extended that care beyond the raw recordings to the exact processing applied to each one, the specific filtering and shaping that made each sound instantly recognizable, the mechanical filter on Vader's voice, the electronic warble in R2-D2's vocabulary, and the specific crackle of a lightsaber igniting were all protected at the studio level. New development teams received approved audio assets for those sounds, shaped and filtered to exact settings. When a developer at EA or Respawn or Aspyr opened a new project that included the B2, they received nothing. There weren't any approved vocal templates or reference clips. They started from scratch, and they made their own choices. The B2 does carry some consistency through its body sounds. The arm blaster charge, the heavy footstep pattern, the servo whine when it turns, those mechanical sounds appear across most versions, but body sounds alone could not anchor a voice the way a catchphrase or a locked filter would. No single studio in the B2's history carried its voice forward to the next, and the gap grew wider with each handoff. Games from EA, Pandemic, LucasArts, Aspyr, and Respawn, animated series under different showrunners, and films from different directors with separate sound teams all touched the B2 at different times with different goals. Each studio brought its own sound designers and its own recording sessions, and none of them had heard what the previous team had recorded. Each team made the B2 sound the way their project needed it to sound, and the results accumulated into a droid that sounded like a different machine in every new release. Lucasfilm's oversight covered the broad creative direction of each project, but that oversight did not extend to specifying which B2 voice was the official one. The droid simply was not high enough on the priority list for that level of attention. A viewer can close their eyes during any Star Wars project, from a 1977 film to a 2024 video game, and recognize the world by sound alone. But the B2 was never part of that recognition. It never appeared in trailers or theme park attractions. It appeared in battle scenes, and when the battle ended, the audience moved on. The B2's voice drifted because Lucasfilm lacked the one thing that could have stopped it, a locked standard defined early and enforced across every project. The sounds that defined the franchise each had one from the start. The B2 did not. Lucasfilm let the same droid become a predator in one game and a punchline in the next film without defining which version was real, and the drift spread from there. Fans who grew up with the B2 carry different versions in their heads. A Republic Commando fan still hears the wrist cannon charging in a dark hallway. Someone who grew up on the Clone Wars remembers a big, slow voice fumbling through a line instead. A Battlefront player hears tactical callouts bark through a gruff filter between blaster fire. Each version is accurate to its source, and none of them sound like the others. The B1 locked its voice into place so early that it never stopped talking, and the real reason those droids talk so much says more about the conflict than any battle ever did. Meanwhile, the general who marched both armies into that war carried a story beneath the armor far more disturbing than anything he did on the battlefield. Be sure to check these videos next.